I've been shooting abandoned buildings around the Midwest for about 8 years, and Detroit is where I ended up going the most. In June 2020, the city was already quiet from the pandemic, and I could drive around Delray or the East Side for hours without seeing another person. That was the whole point. No security guards, no other urban explorers ruining a shot, nobody asking me what I was doing crawling through a broken fence with a camera bag. There's a factory off Riopelle near the old rail lines. I'm not going to say the exact name because people who know Detroit will figure it out, and I don't want anyone else going there. It's a big 4-story brick thing, the kind of place that used to press auto parts and now just holds pigeons. I'd driven past it maybe a dozen times over the years and always told myself I'd come back with better light. That week the forecast was clear, hazy sun in the afternoon, which is what I wanted for the west face. I parked 2 blocks over on a residential street where a couple of houses were still lived in. Someone's dog barked at me from behind a chain link fence the whole time I was getting my gear out. It was maybe 2 in the afternoon, hot in that flat Michigan way where the air just sits on you. My shirt was already stuck to my back before I crossed Jefferson. Getting in was easy. There was a section of the north wall where the plywood over a service door had rotted at the bottom and someone had already peeled it up. I ducked under and stood there for a second, letting my eyes adjust. It smelled the way those places always smell. Pigeon droppings, old motor oil, wet drywall from wherever the roof was gone. There was a slow tick coming from somewhere above me, water dripping onto metal, spaced out like a clock running down. I did the ground floor first. Wide shots of the main pressing hall, a couple of tight shots on a control panel where somebody had spray painted a smiley face over the dials. The light was doing that thing I love, coming through the high windows in long dusty columns. I burned through about 40 frames in the first hour and didn't hear a single thing that wasn't me or the pigeons. I want to be clear about this part because I've thought about it a lot. I was alone. I know I was alone. I'd walked the whole ground floor. The stairwells on both ends were collapsed at the second floor landing, rebar sticking out at angles, no way up unless you had climbing gear. I'd checked because I wanted to shoot from the upper windows and I was annoyed I couldn't. There were no fresh footprints in the dust by either stair. No cigarette butts that looked new, nothing. Around 3:30 I went back outside to shoot the west face from across the lot. That was the shot I'd actually driven out for. The sun was starting to catch the brick, and the windows on the second floor were doing that thing where they look black from the outside, even though there's plenty of light behind them. I sat up on a chunk of broken curb, took maybe 15 frames, changed lenses, took another 10. Then I sat down on the curb and started scrolling through what I had on the back of the camera. The screen on my old Nikon is small. I usually don't check things too carefully in the field, but one of the wide shots looked off in the corner, and I zoomed in to see what it was. There was a man in the second floor window. Not a shape, not a smear, a man. He was standing back from the glass by maybe a foot, wearing something dark, and he was looking down at me. You could see the angle of his head. You could see the shape of his shoulders. His face was in shadow, but you could tell it was a face. He was in the 4th window from the left on the west wall. I sat there on the curb with the camera in my lap for a while. I want to say I felt something dramatic, but the first thing I felt was just confusion. Like when you're doing math and the numbers don't add up and you assume you made a mistake. I scrolled to the frames before and after. Same window, empty, then the one frame with him in it, then empty again. I'd taken those shots maybe 2 seconds apart. I zoomed in more. The image held up. It wasn't a reflection. The angle was wrong for that. It wasn't a mannequin because you could see the shoulders weren't symmetrical. One was slightly lower, the way a real person stands when they're leaning on something, and the head was tilted down, watching me. I laughed a little, not because it was funny. It was just the sound that came out. Then I looked up at the window. Empty. Just black glass and a piece of curtain or plastic sheeting hanging inside, not moving. I stood up. I looked at the other windows on that floor, all empty. I looked at the 3rd floor windows and the 4th floor windows. Nothing. I told myself somebody had to be in there, that maybe there was a way up I hadn't found. I even called out, "Hey," just once. My voice sounded thin in that big lot. Nothing came back except the highway. I want to say I did something brave here. I didn't. I put the lens cap on, packed the camera into my bag, and walked back to my car at a pace that was faster than a walk, but that I was trying to pretend was a walk. I didn't run. I did not once look up at that window again. I remember thinking that if I looked up and he was there now, actually there, I would not be able to handle it. So I kept my eyes on the cracked asphalt in front of me. I got in my car. My hands were shaking enough that I dropped the keys twice. I drove back to my apartment in Ferndale and I did not talk to anyone about it. That night I sat at my desk and loaded the card onto my computer. I looked at that frame on a real screen at full resolution. It was worse. On the big monitor, you could see more of him. You could see his hands were down at his sides. You could see there was something wrong with the proportions of his arms, but I couldn't tell you exactly what. His face was still lost in the shadow of the window frame, but the more I looked, the more I felt like the shadow was the face, if that makes any sense. Like there wasn't anything under it to be shadowed. I did not publish the photo. I run a small site, and I have an Instagram with maybe 11,000 followers who like this kind of work, and I post something from every shoot. I did not post anything from that shoot. I told the two people who asked that the light hadn't worked out. I moved the file to an external drive and put the drive in a drawer. I tried to look up the building's history that week, and I found the usual stuff. The closure dates, a couple of old fires, an OSHA complaint from the 70s. Nothing that explained anything. I stopped looking after a few nights because I noticed I was only doing it late, after midnight, and it was making it worse. About a month later, I was at a coffee shop in Corktown, one of the ones that stayed open through the summer with the plywood still up on the windows next door. There was a guy at the table next to me with a camera bag I recognized, a specific Domkey I'd been thinking about buying. We got to talking the way photographers do. He shot the same kind of stuff I did. We ran through the usual list of places: the Packard, the book depository, the school on the east side. He was maybe 40, quiet, had a beard going gray on one side only. At some point I mentioned the factory off Riopelle. Just the street. I didn't describe the building. He was stirring his coffee and he stopped. He didn't look at me for a second. Then he said, "You went inside?" I said, "Yeah, I'd gotten some good frames of the pressing hall." I said the light had been decent. He asked if I got anything from outside, from the lot on the west side. I don't know why I did it. Maybe because he'd asked so specifically, maybe because I'd been carrying it around for a month and I wanted somebody else to see it and tell me I was wrong about what I was looking at. I pulled out my phone. I'd taken a picture of the screen the night I first saw it, just the one frame, zoomed in on the window. I turned the phone around and slid it across the table to him. He looked at it for maybe 3 seconds. He didn't zoom in. He didn't ask any questions. He slid the phone back to me and picked up his bag and stood up. He was already putting money on the table when he said it. "That building doesn't need to be touched." Then he walked out. I sat there with my coffee for a while. I watched him through the window. He didn't look back at the shop. He got into an old Tacoma parked across the street and drove off. I never saw him again. I looked for his work online later, based on a couple of the shoots he'd mentioned, and I think I found his Flickr, but there was nothing on it from the last 2 years, and no way to message him. The drive is still in the drawer. I've thought about deleting the file more times than I can count, and I've never done it, and I can't tell you why. I don't go to that part of the city anymore. When I'm driving on I-75 and I know I'm going past the general area, I keep my eyes on the road. Been running dispatch at a small taxi company in Montana for about 6 years. Small town, maybe 12,000 people, 3 cars on the road at night if we were lucky. Most Friday nights were slow. Drunks from the 2 bars downtown, a few kids getting rides home from parties, sometimes a nurse coming off shift at the county hospital. The pattern started to bother me around November 2021, but honestly, it had probably been going on longer than that. I just wasn't the one taking the call. Every Friday, about 10 minutes before 2 in the morning, the phone would ring. Same voice every time. Older guy, quiet, polite. He'd give the address, 412 Larkspur Drive, and he'd say the same thing. 1 passenger, cemetery on Route 200. He'll need to wait 5 minutes there, then bring me home. Never asked the price. Never asked how long. I'd log it, radio one of the drivers, and that was it. I've been doing this job long enough that I don't really notice individual fares. You get a rhythm, somebody calls, you write down where they are and where they're going, you check who's closest, you send the car, that's most of it. Half the time by the end of a shift I couldn't tell you who I dispatched to what address. The thing is, whoever caught that Friday fare would come back weird. Not scared exactly, just off. Quiet in a way our drivers usually aren't. Our guys talked. That's most of the job, honestly. Sitting in the lot at 3 in the morning chewing sunflower seeds and running their mouth about whatever. But after that fare, they'd come in, sign out, and just kind of stand there for a second before going home. I noticed it first with Dale. Dale was a big man, ex-logger, worked nights because his back couldn't take day work anymore. Nothing bothered Dale. He'd driven the guy who got sick in the back of the Crown Vic in July, cleaned it himself, was back on the road in an hour, cracking jokes about it. He came in from that Friday run and sat down across from the dispatch window. Just sat. I asked him what was up. "Strange passenger," he said. I waited. Dale usually had a whole story. He didn't say anything else. Just took his keys off the hook and went home. Next Friday, Marco had the fare. Marco was maybe 23, kind of a nervous kid, but a good driver. He came in around 2:30 and lit a cigarette by the back door even though he wasn't supposed to. I let it go. He looked at me through the glass and shook his head a little. "That was a strange one," he said. The 412 Larkspur? Yeah. What happened? He thought about it for a long time. Then he said, Nothing. Nothing happened. That's the thing. He put the cigarette out on the concrete and came inside to sign out. Once you notice something like that, you can't stop noticing it. I started paying attention to who took the fare and how they came back. Kenny, who'd been driving for us since the 90s, came in one Friday and said the guy was the politest passenger I ever had. He said it like it wasn't a compliment. He said it like it was a warning about something. I asked him about it later, at the end of his shift, when he came in for his last coffee. Kenny had known me long enough to be straight. I said, "What is it about that guy?" He took a long time before he answered. Finally, he said, "There's nothing about him. That's the thing. There's just nothing." I didn't know what he meant. I'm not sure I do now. Then Ray had it. Ray was the kind of guy who'd tell you the whole life story of anyone he drove for more than 10 minutes. He came back from that fare and I asked him, and he shrugged, and he said, "I don't know." He didn't say much. He didn't say hardly anything. And then Ray, who normally hung around after his shift for another hour drinking coffee out of the pot in dispatch, put on his coat and left. I want to be clear about something. Nothing was ever wrong with the trip itself. The address was real. It was a nice little house on a nice little street, siding kept up, driveway shoveled clean, even in the middle of January. The passenger tipped every time, cash, exact same amount. The cemetery on Route 200 was a public one. Gate never locked, the kind of place where people leave flowers and no one bothers them. There was no reason for any of it to feel like anything. That's what got under my skin. By the second week of January, I decided I'd just take the fare myself. I did that sometimes anyway when we were short. I told the guys I'd cover it and to stay on the other calls. None of them argued. Kenny looked at me over his coffee like he wanted to say something and then didn't. That Friday, I drove the number 2 car out to Larkspur Drive around 1:45. It was maybe 8 degrees out, the kind of Montana night where the snow makes that squeaky sound under the tires, and the streetlights have those halos around them because of the ice in the air. I sat in the driveway with the heater going and watched the house. At exactly 1:58, the porch light came on. Front door opened. An older man came out. He was probably in his late 70s. Wool coat, gray, buttoned all the way up. Nice hat, the kind my grandfather used to wear. He was carrying a small paper-wrapped bundle in one hand. He locked the door behind him carefully, tested the knob, and walked down the path to the car. He didn't hurry. He didn't slip on the ice either, and there was ice. He got in the back and closed the door softly. He said, "Good evening. Thank you for coming out." His voice was exactly like on the phone. I said, "Cemetery on 200? Please." I pulled out. He didn't say anything on the drive, not in a rude way. He just sat and looked out the window at the town going by. I could see him in the rear view once or twice. He looked tired, not sad, exactly. Just tired in a way I've only ever seen in old men who have been up too many nights in a row for reasons they don't tell you about. I kept wanting to ask. I want to be honest about that. There was this whole pressure in my chest the whole drive, the kind you get when you know you should say something and you don't know what. I didn't say anything either. The cemetery gate was open. I pulled onto the little gravel loop and stopped where he pointed, near the back, by a row of headstones under a big pine that had snow piled on the branches so thick it looked fake. He got out with his bundle. 5 minutes, he said, if that's all right. Take your time. He walked between the stones. He knew exactly where he was going. I watched him stop at one of them, near the tree, and crouch down. He brushed snow off the top of the stone with his glove. Then he unwrapped the bundle. I couldn't see what it was from where I was parked. He set it down against the base of the stone. He stayed there a while, hands on his knees, head down. He wasn't crying, or if he was, I couldn't tell. The engine ticked over, the heater fan running. From where I sat, I could hear the wind moving through the pine branches, that dry sound they make in winter when everything is frozen. Somewhere out on Route 200, a truck went by, downshifting for the long grade. Then it was quiet again. He stood up slow, the way older men do when their knees hurt. He put his hand flat on the top of the stone for a second. Then he walked back to the car. He got in and said, "Thank you. We can go back now." We drove. About halfway home, he said, "My wife passed on a Friday night, January a few years ago. I don't like her to be alone that night." I said, "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. She had a long life." He looked out the window. "I come every Friday. It's not a lot to ask once a week." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything, and he didn't seem to need me to. We rode the rest of the way in quiet. I pulled into his driveway at 2:41. He paid, exact same amount as always, and added the tip on top. He got out and stopped for a second with his hand on the top of the open door. "You're the new driver," he said. "I'm the dispatcher usually, filling in tonight." He nodded, like that made sense to him. "Good night." "Good night, sir." He closed the door and went up the walk. Porch light went off after he was inside. I sat in the driveway for a minute with the heater running. Then I drove back to the lot. Kenny was still there, sitting in his cab with the door open, smoking. He didn't ask how it went. He just looked at me and I looked at him and he sort of nodded, and I nodded back, and I went inside and hung the keys up. I thought a lot about it after, about the guys who'd taken that fare before me. Not one of them was scared of that man. That's not what any of it was. Every one of them had felt something in that car, and every one of them had decided, without ever talking to each other about it, that the polite thing was to keep it to themselves. He was just a man going to see his wife. That's all it ever was. I kept dispatching the fare every Friday. I never asked another driver about it again, and none of them ever brought it up to me. When the phone rings at 1:50 on a Friday morning, I pick it up before it rings twice, and I write down the address I already know, and I send the car. Sometimes I still take it myself. He always says good evening. I always say good night, sir. I don't ask. The gym I rented on the east side of Nashville wasn't much. 2,000 square feet off Gallatin Pike, above a tire shop that closed at 6. I did private sessions there in the evenings, mostly women who'd been through something, sometimes older guys worried about carjackings. Cash was normal. Fake names were normal. That's the thing about the safety business. You get people who don't want a paper trail, and you learn early not to push. He called on a Tuesday in the middle of October, said he found me through a friend, wouldn't say which one. Voice was flat, not nervous, not friendly, just flat, like he was reading from a page. He asked how much for 4 one-hour sessions. I told him. He said he'd pay up front, in cash, and could we start Thursday? I said sure. He showed up 10 minutes early. Middle 30s, average build, khakis, and a plain gray t-shirt with no logo on it. Clean shave. His hair was that in-between brown that doesn't stick in your head after you look away. He handed me an envelope with $440 in it, counted out in 20s, and told me his name was Mark. No last name offered, and I didn't ask for one. Sign-in sheet was optional. He didn't sign. The first session, I ran him through what I run everybody through. Situational awareness, stance, how to break a wrist grab, how to create distance, how to use your voice. He was polite about it, nodded at the right times. But when I got to the wrist grab, he asked me to slow it down and show him the grip again, from my side. Not how to break it, how I was holding him. I figured he was one of those guys who processes by understanding the whole picture. Some clients are like that, engineers especially, so I showed him again, and he asked what I would do if the person I was holding was smaller, and how much pressure I actually needed to keep them from pulling free. I told him it depends. He nodded like I'd given him something useful. We finished the hour on footwork. He paid attention, said thank you, left through the back stairs because the front door locks automatically after 7 and I'd already dropped the bolt. Second session, the next Tuesday. He said his name was Kevin when he came in. I remember thinking that was strange for about half a second and then I let it go. People misspeak. Maybe I'd misheard him the first time. I don't run a bank. I run a gym above a tire shop. If a guy wants to be Kevin, he can be Kevin. That session he wanted to work on holds. Specifically, he wanted to know how to keep someone still without hurting them. He phrased it like a safety concern. He said, "Say I'm restraining somebody until the police come. I don't want to break their arm by accident." That's a reasonable question. I get versions of it from bouncers and from the occasional bail bondsman, so I showed him a seated restraint from behind. Arms crossed over the chest, your body low, your weight braced. He tried it on the pad dummy, then asked if he could try it on me. I let him. He got it about right on the second attempt. Then he asked how long a person could be held like that before their arms went numb. I said a while. Depends on the person. He asked if numbness left marks. I told him no, not really. Bruises come from impact or from prolonged pressure on soft tissue. A hold like this, done right, wouldn't leave much of anything. He asked me to say that again. Not aggressively, he just asked me to repeat it, the way you ask somebody to repeat a phone number so you can write it down. I repeated it. He nodded and said, "Okay, good." We spent the rest of the hour on the same hold. He wanted to know the angle. He wanted to know how to shift if the person tried to bite. He wanted to know how to move them from a chair to the floor without ever letting go of both arms at once. I remember standing there in the middle of the mat while he worked through it on the dummy for the 5th time and thinking, this guy is not learning self-defense. This guy is learning something else. But I've had that thought before, and usually I'm wrong. Usually the client turns out to be a nurse who works with dementia patients, or a foster dad whose kid has meltdowns. I told myself I'd ask him about it next session. Casually, see what he said. He came back for the 3rd session on a Thursday. It was drizzling. I remember because the parking lot lights were making halos in the rain when I unlocked the back stairs, and the tire shop had left a stack of old rims out by the dumpster that were catching the water. Inside, the radiator was ticking. The place smelled the way it always smelled in October, rubber mats and floor cleaner and faintly, the diesel from downstairs. He came up the stairs at 6:30 on the dot. He was carrying a small black gym bag this time, which he hadn't brought before. He put it down by the wall, shook my hand, Said his name was Chris. That's the one I caught. Not right away. Halfway through the warm-up, I was watching him do jumping jacks on the mat and I thought, wait, Chris. Last week he was Kevin. First week he was Mark. I ran back through it a couple of times to make sure I wasn't the one confusing myself. I wasn't. I didn't say anything. I finished the warm-up. Then he walked over to his gym bag and unzipped it and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. Metal ones. Not the fuzzy kind you'd find in a novelty shop. Real ones. The kind with a double lock and a keyway on the side. He held them up and gave me a small, apologetic smile, like he was showing me a piece of equipment he wasn't sure I'd approve of. He said, I thought it'd be more realistic if we practiced with these. I want to know what to do if somebody actually got them on me. I stood there on the mat. I want to be honest about this part, because I've thought about it a lot since. I didn't feel afraid. I felt something quieter than that. I felt the way you feel when you're driving and you realize the car in front of you has been drifting for a while and you've only just noticed, a kind of late arrival at something obvious. I said, where'd you get those? He said, Amazon. I said, huh. We stood there for a second. The radiator ticked. Downstairs, somebody in the alley slammed a car door. I told him I appreciated the initiative, but we weren't going to be using restraints in here. Liability thing, I said. Insurance. I told him we could do the same drills with a length of webbing, which we already had, and it'd get him the same result. He didn't argue. He put the handcuffs back in his bag, zipped it up, nodded slowly, like he was filing that away for later. We did the rest of the hour on breaks from grip holds. I kept it moving. I kept him talking, but only about the drills, nothing personal. When I ran a technique, I did it with the dummy, or with my own body against the wall, not with him. He noticed. He didn't say anything about it, but I could feel him noticing. Every time I stepped back to let him work solo, he'd wait an extra beat before starting, watching me. At the end of the hour, I told him I was going to have to cancel the 4th session. Booked something out of town last minute, I said. I told him I could refund the last 110 right there in cash, and I did, from the drawer in the front desk. He took the money and folded it into his back pocket without counting it. He said, that's a shame. I said, yeah, sorry about that. He said, well, maybe another time. He didn't say it like a threat. He said it the way anybody says it. That's the part that stuck. The whole time, from the first handshake to the last, there had never been anything on his face that you could call a threat. Just a guy in a gym, learning what he came to learn. He walked down the back stairs and out into the parking lot. I watched him from the window. He got into a small silver sedan, the kind that could be any of 6 models, and pulled out onto Gallatin Pike heading south. I couldn't see his plate from that angle. I didn't try to. I locked the front door, then the back. Then I sat down at the desk and pulled the folder where I keep the intake notes. 3 sessions. Mark, then Kevin, then Chris. I checked each one twice. The phone number he'd given me on the first call, I punched into a reverse lookup on my laptop. It came back as a prepaid line. No carrier account, no address. I called it from a burner app just to see. It rang twice, and then a recorded voice said the number was no longer in service. I sat there in the office for a long time with the radiator ticking behind me. I thought about calling the police. I thought about what I'd tell them. A man came to my gym 3 times, paid cash, gave 3 different first names, and bought handcuffs off Amazon. He didn't threaten anybody. He didn't hurt anybody. He learned how to hold a person still without leaving bruises, and he learned it from me. I didn't call. I told a couple of people in the business, quietly, described him. Nobody had seen anybody like that. I keep watching the news out of Nashville and out of the towns around it. I read the missing persons pages sometimes when I can't sleep. I don't know what I'm looking for. I don't know if I'd recognize it if I saw it. It's been a little over 2 years. I still teach out of the same gym. I keep the drawer locked now, and I don't take cash from anybody I haven't met through somebody I trust. When a new client calls, I ask more questions than I used to. Most of them are fine with that. A few hang up. I don't know what he did after he left the parking lot. I don't know if he did anything. That's the part I can't get past. Not that I know something bad happened, that I don't, and I never will, and either way I'm the one who taught him. Thanks for watching. I hope you had a good time getting creeped out. Tell me in the comments which story you liked best from this video. And while you're here, go check out the other vids on the channel. See you soon, bye.